Scanning your film at home is a really good skill to have because if you love shooting film, then you know that those lab costs add up quickly. So let's talk today about what you need to start scanning your film at home by yourself. It does take some experience, but it's really not as complicated as you might think. There are two main techniques that you can use to scan your film at home. You can use a flatbed scanner like the Epson Perfection V600 photo scanner, or you can actually use your digital camera to digitize your negatives. Both of these have pros and cons. Using a flatbed scanner is really good for somebody who's looking for an easy and quick setup, but it might not be the best, most high quality scan. If you don't already have a high megapixel camera at home, then the flatbed scanner is definitely the more affordable option. If you do already have a camera though, then camera scanning might be for you. Your image quality will be as good as it's going to get, and you have full control over all of your settings. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on the camera scanning method, and I'll give you a step-by-step guide on how to get the most out of your negatives. So let's gather all the gear we need to start scanning. We need a DSLR or mirrorless camera with a good megapixel count and manual settings. I will be using the Sony a7R IV, which is a 61 megapixel camera. We need a macro lens, or you could also try a macro lens adapter. I will be using the beautiful Sony 90mm f2.8 macro GM lens. Then we need a light source, like a light table and a film holder. You can buy these together. We will be using the negative supply 4x5 light source with the basic film carrier for 35mm and 120 film. We also need a sturdy tripod that you can angle all the way down. We are using the Magnus TR13 travel tripod, which is also very budget friendly. A remote shutter release is not a must-have, but definitely useful and speeds up the process. We're using the Velo shutter release. And of course we need a computer and image editing software like Adobe Lightroom and a tethering cable. We're using the USB-C cable from Tether Tools. Another nice thing to have is compressed air or a blower brush because it's useful to help keep your negatives as clean and dust-free as possible. I've got the Sensei Hurricane blower. Alright, so let's set it all up. We need a flat surface to put our light box on and mount the camera on the tripod to shoot straight down. This is where it's important to note that you need a tripod that has the flat layability, so make sure you grab one that can do this. It's important that your tripod is really sturdy. Tripods oftentimes have this little hook right here where you can attach a weight, and you always have to make sure that the legs are fully unfolded. To prepare your negatives, it's best to carefully cut them into manageable strips, maybe 4 to 6 frames per strip. Gently clean them with the compressed air or the blower, and make sure to only handle them by the edges to avoid fingerprints. Then you can put the negatives into the film holder and position it onto your light panel. And now for the difficult part. Let's see what we need to do to set up this camera. Set your camera to manual mode to have full control over your exposure settings. For ISO, set a low ISO, maybe 100 or 200, to minimize the noise. For the aperture, it's best to stay between f8 and f11 to ensure a wide depth of field and sharpness. And then you can adjust the shutter speed to achieve the correct exposure. You can use the histogram for this to ensure that the highlights and shadows are properly exposed. Set the white balance to match your light source. You should also shoot in RAW to allow for adjusting the white balance in post-processing. And then of course we need to focus on the negative. It's best to use manual focus for this, and you can use live view and zoom in to ensure precise focus. You want to see the film grain. You should be able to see this in the viewfinder, but you could also tether your camera to a larger screen if you want to see things clearer. You may also consider turning your focus peaking on to help with precision. Make sure that the negative fills the entire frame of your viewfinder and that there's no distortion. This can happen when your camera isn't pointed downwards perfectly, and you might see that the borders of your negative don't align perfectly with the borders of your frame. If you don't have a remote shutter release, you can also use the self-timer on your camera. Otherwise, you might accidentally shake the camera just a little bit, and that could lead to a little bit of blur and less sharp images. The setup can take some time, but once you have it, this is actually quite a quick way to get your scans. Your digital camera, of course, captures the negative exactly as it sees it. Negative. This can be a little bit tricky and intimidating, but don't worry, we'll get there. Import your images to Lightroom, Photoshop, or any other editing software you might already have. Then invert your colors. This looks different for each software, and there are even presets and plugins available to do this for you. Don't be afraid to use the levels or curves tool to correct everything from exposure to contrast to color balance. You can play around with it until the image looks exactly how you want it to look. You can copy and paste these settings onto all of your images and then readjust for each individual image. This really is the beauty of scanning with your camera. You have full control over your results. If you did end up with some scratches or dust on your image, feel free to use the clone or healing tool to remove those. There is a chance the negative doesn't perfectly line up with your camera, so crop out any unwanted black frames if you want to. Once you're happy with your result, export and share. Here are some quick tips for better results. Use a good macro lens. A high-quality macro lens will capture more detail and reduce distortion. Keep everything clean. Ensure your negatives, lens, and light source are clean to avoid dust and smudges. Feel free to experiment with settings. Different films and lighting conditions may require different settings, so experiment to find the best setup for your needs. This is definitely a process that takes some practice and patience, but it's an amazing skill to have, especially if you're someone that enjoys shooting film or even if you want to archive your family's photos in a cost-effective way. In the next video, we're going to talk all about printing your photos, so stick around for that. What questions do you have about this process? Is this something you've done before? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below.